Hi there. Welcome to Pithy Polemics. We're a group of friends who are interested in discussing topics in philosophy, theology, history, fantasy, and more. My name is James Liang. This is the 8th video in a chapter-by-chapter series on Brian Davies' book, The Thought of Thomas Aquinas, which provides an overview of Aquinas' positions on a number of theological issues. In this video, I'll be discussing chapter 8 of the book, Will to Mercy, which discusses Aquinas' understanding of God's will, love, justice, and mercy. Davies starts off by stating that Aquinas departs from many of his predecessors by affirming that God has and exercises will, which he defines as a voluntary decision to act. Both Aristotle and Plotinus thought that although God is the cause of everything in the universe, he doesn't have a will because he's immutable and only passively brings things about. In contrast, Aquinas reasons that because God is omniscient, he knows what is good, and to know the good is to will it. Therefore, God has a will. At this point, you might be wondering, how does Aquinas conclude that if you know the good, then you will it? After all, isn't it possible to know what's good for you but refrain from doing it? Yes, Aquinas says, but only because what you will instead of the good isn't bad, but also good, albeit a lesser good. For Aquinas, if you know the good, then you're drawn to it, and being drawn to the good is what it means to will something. You'll remember from the last chapter that God's knowledge is primarily self-knowledge. This, in conjunction with the idea that God is the source and exemplar of all that's good, and is indeed goodness itself, leads to the conclusion that God necessarily wills himself. God is the object of his own desire, and he's fully satisfied in himself, not needing anything else to be happy. But God also wills other things, that is, everything in existence other than himself. However, Aquinas stresses that God does so neither out of necessity, as God doesn't need anything outside of himself, nor due to outside coercion, as God is impassible. Make no mistake, God's will is eternal and unchangeable, but nevertheless, it stems completely and freely from himself. At this point, Davies stresses two qualifications regarding God's act of willing. The first is that although God wills different things at different times, God's will doesn't undergo change. Every second, something in the world is changing. Each change is produced as a result of God's will. However, this doesn't mean that God wills one thing one second, and then wills a different thing the next. Rather, God eternally wills that one thing happens at this time, and then the next thing happens at that time. That way, God can will that things change, even though his will doesn't change. The second qualification is that in willing things beside himself, he's actually still willing himself. What does he mean by this? Well, let's remember from chapter 5 that all created things strive towards the good, and since God is the ultimate good, all things strive towards God. Hence, by willing to create things that strive towards the good, God is really willing himself. God isn't willing two different things. Functionally, God willing himself and God willing other things ends up being the same thing. Davies also explains that God didn't have to create the universe exactly as it is. For Aquinas, existence itself is good, so God is free to create any number of different possible universes with different kinds and different amounts of things. But this begs the question, why did God create our universe the way it is? One kind of answer that Aquinas gives is that God's reason for creating a universe with such diversity as ours is to express his identity as the source of being and reflect his goodness. But once again, Davies emphasizes that although God has reasons for creating the universe the way it is, those reasons don't compel him to do so. In other words, God doesn't need a contrastive explanation for his decision to create. He has a reason for creating this universe, but not one for creating this universe rather than another, or refraining from creating altogether. Davies transitions here to the topic of love, explaining how Aquinas related God's will to his love. When he says that God loves, he doesn't mean love in the way we typically understand it, being emotionally involved with and dependent on another person. Remember, for Aquinas, God is impassible, he doesn't stand in real relations with creatures, and he's perfectly satisfied in himself. Rather, Aquinas identifies love as just that act of being drawn to the good, and since God wills the good of necessity, he's a being who loves out of necessity, and the object of his love is himself. However, just as with his will, God loves his creation too, since it's a good that God willed into being. Hence, God's goodness, will, and love are all interconnected. From here, Davies tackles the challenge of how God can be both perfectly just and perfectly merciful. Justice demands judgment according to one's deserts, while mercy is the waiving of that very judgment. How can God do both? Aquinas' unique answer to this problem relies on primarily understanding God's justice as distributive. Aristotle distinguished between two forms of justice: commutative justice, which deals with people being treated fairly under the law and participating in fair exchanges, and distributive justice, which deals with the fair allocation of resources such that no one's needs are unmet. Aquinas suggested that distributive justice is perfectly achieved in God, not only because he creates all things with the natures that are proper for them, but also, and primarily, because in doing so, he gives what is due to himself. God is perfectly just because he orders all things according to the eternal law, the operating logic of the universe in which everything acts according to its nature and is directed towards its own good. Thus, God fulfills what is due to his creatures, as well as to himself. Yet, at the same time, God is perfectly merciful, as none of his creatures deserve the goodness that God gives them. Indeed, just in the very act of creating and giving existence to things that previously didn't exist, God displays his full mercy. Hence, there's no incompatibility between God's justice and mercy. God is just because he gives to all no less than what they deserve, and God is merciful because he gives them more than what they deserve. It's on this note that Davies ends the chapter, so it's time for my evaluation. First, I'd like to take a moment to admire how much of an intellectual giant Aquinas was to put together such an elaborate system that's able to provide an explanation for how an immutable and impassible God can will and love things. Understandably, this was an issue that seemed so intractable that even Aristotle didn't ascribe these things to God. But of course, as a Christian, Aquinas wanted to affirm that God is personal, loving, just, and merciful. It's important to underscore how much more difficult this task was, given that these attributes needed to be identical to God's act, as per the doctrine of divine simplicity. But in spite of the odds, it looks like he did it. For all intents and purposes, the theological construct he arrived at is an elegant solution that's both consistent with divine simplicity and successful at ascribing to God these important predicates without redefining them in too ad hoc a fashion. I also want to appreciate that his system smoothly incorporates some distinctly Christian teachings. For example, Aquinas says that God loves out of necessity, with the primary object of his love being himself. This coheres very well with the New Testament's depiction of God as a being whose defining feature is love, as well as the internal love relationship that exists between the members of the Trinity. Furthermore, Aquinas says that although God loves his creation ultimately expresses God's self-love in its orientation toward himself. Again, this fits very nicely with the idea that everything God does is for his own glory. Aquinas stands shoulder to shoulder with the Westminster Assembly in affirming that man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy him forever. So in every element of this system, Aquinas' genius shines through. That being said, at the end of the day, I have to be the bearer of bad news. I believe the biggest downfall of his system is that his conceptions of these attributes are drastically different from our normal understanding of them. On Aquinas' conception, God's goodness, will, and love are all metaphysically tied together with a single immutable act of creation, such that you can't have one without the others. The problem with this construction is that you can't affirm the richer, more robust expressions of these attributes in God that require the exclusion of one or more. For example, Aquinas can't say that God wills for evil to happen to someone in order for a greater good to come of it, since the object of God's will can only be good. He can't say that God changes his will in response to the free decisions of creatures, for instance, in response to prayer. He can't say that God loves us in the sense of desiring to be in a personal relationship with us, or to share in our joys and sorrows, because God is impassible. The same is true of Aquinas' conception of God's justice and mercy. In order to maintain that God displays both justice and mercy in every one of his works, Aquinas has to redefine these terms in a very non-standard way. Justice is the creation of things according to their proper natures, and mercy is the act of creation itself. On this account, God doesn't experience righteous anger or personal hurt as he reluctantly doles out retributive punishment on the unrepentant sinner. Neither does he experience kindness or tenderness towards those he forgives for their sins. Instead, you get these watered-down notions of justice and mercy that follow from the rigid constraints of divine simplicity. Here, the Thomists might want to interject and say, wait a minute, you only think this because you're used to the way that human beings experience these attributes. Of course God is going to express these things differently from us, because he's a totally different being that we can't fully understand. Of course it's going to seem weird to us. Okay, fair enough. But I still want to press the point. According to the doctrine of analogy, God expresses all of his attributes primarily, and creatures express all of theirs secondarily. In other words, the way we exhibit will, love, justice, and mercy is going to be derivative of and inferior to the way God expresses them. Let me ask you, when you hear that God is just because he gives monkeys opposable thumbs in accordance with their monkey nature, and God is merciful because he spared monkeys from the cruel fate of non-existence, is that really the impression you get? That's it for my thoughts. Next time, I'll be summarizing chapter 9 of Davies' book, Providence and Freedom, which explains Aquinas' account of God's providence, miracles, and human freedom. I hope you enjoyed this video. If this has been helpful to you, please help us out and like, share, and subscribe. Also make sure to hit that bell button for notifications. If you think I'm onto something or you think I'm dead wrong, please feel free to drop a comment down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you like this content, come check out our channel for more videos on interesting topics and discussions. With that, I'll see you in the next video.